Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the University of Virginia School of Education and Human Development Speaker Series talk. We are delighted to have with us Dr. Bianca Baldridge this morning, and we are delighted to have you all with us. We are happy to be able to be together virtually even when we can't be together in person. So I'm going to give a brief introduction to sort of this talk as part of a series, and then I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Dr. Ben Allen, who will introduce Dr. Baldridge. So as I mentioned, today's talk is part of the Virginia Speaker Series, the School of Ed Speaker Series, and we're very excited here at Youth-Nex to be sponsoring the talk today and to be joined in co-sponsorship by the UVA Equity Center, the Center for Race and Public Education in the South, the VEST Research Lectureship Series, and the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the School of Education and Human Development. I think that the large number of co-sponsors for this event really demonstrates the excitement we all feel about Dr. Baldridge as a speaker and this topic of importance. So I'm thrilled to have her here, to have this group of co-sponsors with us, and to have you all in the audience. Quick note about the talk. You can ask questions throughout the session, but we will ask you to use the Q&A option, which is located at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can type in any questions that you have, and I'll be moderating the Q&A. So we will keep hold of those questions until question and answer time. And then during the designated question and answer time, after the talk itself, you can raise your hand if you want to, or type in the questions to the Q&A. Either one of those would work. And if you raise your hand during the Q&A, we will unmute you so you can ask your question. So I'm now going to turn over to my colleague, Dr. Ben Allen, the director of the UVA Equity Center, or the Center for the Redress of Inequity through Community Engaged Scholarship, if you want its full title, and he will introduce Dr. Baldridge. Dr. Allen.
Thank you, Dr. Deutsch. Good morning, everyone. It is truly my honor to introduce Dr. Bianca J. Baldridge. She is an associate professor in the Department of Educational Policy Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She earned her PhD in sociology and education from Columbia University Teachers College. Her scholarship explores the socio-political context of community-based youth work and, and after-school education. Bianca's research critically examines the confluence of race, class, and gender and its impact on educational reforms that shape community-based spaces that engage Black youth and Latinx youth. She explores the organizational and pedagogical practices employed by youth workers, community-based educators amidst neoliberal education restructuring. Her book, The Stanford University Press, Reclaiming Community, Race, and Uncertain Future of Youth Work, examines how the privatization of public education undermines Black community-based organizations' efforts to support comprehensive youth development opportunities. And we are grateful to have her here this morning. And with that, Dr. Baldridge, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Allen, for that introduction. I'm really excited to be here with you all today. First, I'd like to thank Professor Nancy Deutsch for the invitation to engage with you all. I'd also like to thank the Youth-Nex, as well as the Equity Center, the UVA School of Education and Human Development. And I want to give just my gratitude for everyone who's responsible for getting me here today. I am especially grateful for the educators who are working within schools, within community-based organizations, amid everything that's happening in the world. I know the gravity of your work, and thank you for taking the time to be present with me today. So my talk today, it's entitled Reimagining Youth Work and Youth Workers in the Ongoing Struggle for Racial Justice. And during our time today, I want to share some reflections about what I see as the ongoing struggle for racial justice and connections to liberal discourses. And I want to share my work with you all in a city that is not dissimilar from Charlottesville, that I call Pleasant Ridge. And then I want to end by sharing some opportunities that I see in youth development programs at this very moment. So before I became a professor, I was a youth worker. I had the privilege of working with middle and high school students in several cities, both in the US and abroad. And my research is deeply informed by my experiences as a youth worker. As a sociologist of education, I study the sociopolitical context of youth work, meaning that I name the dynamics of race and capitalism and heteropatriarchy and all those things that shape not just our schools, but our youth development programs as well. I study the experiences of Black youth workers, the experiences of youth workers more broadly, and then the experiences of Black youth and Latinx youth within these settings. I see these places as sites of possibility, as sites of resistance, as radical care, and I also see them as a part of a longer history of struggle for Black freedom. But I also see them as sites of paradox and contradiction. And, I'm present with you all today with a heavy heart, as I feel like I've been in a perpetual state of mourning, whether it's thinking about, the 200,000 plus lives we've lost due to COVID-19, or the Black lives who have been taken by state-sanctioned police violence, white vigilantism. I have to remind myself that this is not just a moment. I'm reminded of the words of Alicia Garza, one of the co-creators of the Black Lives Matter movement, who encourages us not to talk about our current reality as a moment, but to consider it as another iteration of the movement, and that this fight for racial justice is ongoing. What we are currently facing as a nation is not new, even if it feels that way. Anti-Black racism is endemic to this nation. Assault on Indigenous communities and their land is not new. Family separation at our nation's borders and their grotesque, xenophobic, physical, and psychic violence being enacted on children and their families is unfortunately not new. State violence with impunity isn't new. Economic injustice and job precarity on top of a global health pandemic that is disproportionately impacting Indigenous, Black, and Latinx communities feels like too much to bear sometimes. Despite this reality, as a former youth worker, scholar, and educator, I'm comforted by the brilliance of young people, and I try to think about the opportunities that are emerging within the out-of-school time sector and the youth work sector more broadly in this moment. As difficult as it may be to think about the good that can come from this moment, it does shine a light on the strengths of community-based youth work in fostering deep connections to the outdoors, strong relationships rooted in care, radical healing, and a focus on cultural, social, and political development and resistance for young people. This moment offers us an opportunity to appreciate youth work and provide the support and investment that it requires to lift up the aspects of youth work that contribute to a more just society. Coping and working under the stress of a global health pandemic indeed produces challenges in how we exist within physical space, how we mobilize, and how we educate and approach our research in the future. But community-based youth spaces can cultivate opportunities for youth to share, process, and develop a critique of the world and strategize ways to resist the structural oppressions that shape their lives. Our nation is in a state of righteous resistance against racial injustice and state violence. This fight is ongoing, and Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other communities of color have been in this fight. I think about community-based youth workspaces, especially for Black youth and other minoritized and marginalized young people, as a space of refuge against the hostility of racism and other systems of oppression and violence. However, as scholars and educators within and outside of schools, one of the questions that I want to have us sit with today is how can we fight for racial justice if we do not acknowledge, understand, and disrupt the racism, anti-Blackness, and systemic whiteness that functions through educational spaces, especially within the out-of-school time sector. In my time with you all today, I want us to reckon with and critically reflect on the spaces we create with, for, and alongside young people within communities, especially within contexts that claim to be liberal or progressive and committed to social justice, anti-racism, and equity. What does our investment and claims of liberal goodness do for us and for the communities we claim to care about? How does white discomfort overshadow the anti-Blackness and racism experienced by Black, Indigenous, Latinx, and other minoritized youth and youth workers? In my talk today, I'll share what I've learned from my research in a context that's very similar to yours, to Charlottesville, and that's not dissimilar from predominantly white college liberal towns. I will share the perspectives and stories of longtime Black youth workers and activists, the experiences of Black youth and program leaders that I hope will be instructive. For scholars of youth work and education, I hope the ideas that I share will help us approach our work in more humanizing ways as we describe the significance of the sector without positioning vulnerable communities from a position of lack or from a deficit perspective. For youth workers and program leaders, I hope the ideas I share from my research will be helpful as tools of reflection to examine what we believe, what we claim we believe, what we claim we do, and what we actually do, and how it actually might undermine the youth and communities we engage with. So the present iteration of uprisings and rebellions against anti-Black violence and police brutality offers us a critical reminder that the broader socio-political context of youth development is always present. It demands our attention, our study, and our understanding. Having a real understanding of the nuances and complexities of racism, patriarchy, economic injustice, other forms of domination, should shift our understanding about why we do this work. This demands that we reframe our work and abandon the idea that we're fixing youth, but rather we are recognizing and aware of systemic inequalities that shape the lives of young people that we engage with, and also shapes how we move through the world, how we think about young people, how we design programming for them, and how we engage them. In doing so, I believe we can be forced to remove savior narratives which breeds to paternalism and deficit language that is so rampant in youth work to honor young people, their communities, and families. In my work, I've argued that while schools are consistently included in discourse on racism and education, community-based youth organizations and the pedagogical strategies they employ are often overlooked in the ways they can both challenge, disrupt, and reproduce anti-Black racism. To be clear, as I argue in a recent paper, the field of youth work is engrossed by paternalism and deficit ideologies about minoritized communities. This produces an inevitable contradiction, or what I call a paradox, where youth work spaces can be both affirming and humanizing spaces for youth on one hand, and at the same time also be framed as places of containment in which minoritized youth are framed in deficit ways, therefore reproducing harm. Today, I want to spend some time talking about my current research in a predominantly white, self-proclaimed liberal and progressive college town that I call Pleasant Ridge. So the community of Pleasant Ridge exists within deep contradiction. On one hand, it boasts as a nice and liberal city. It's always consistently voted as one of the best places to live, one of the most happiest cities, one of America's most livable cities. At the same time, over 70% of Black youth live below the poverty line, which is higher than the state and national average. On the other hand, in addition to that, statistics echo other predominantly white cities throughout the country that are deemed liberal and progressive, but represent a divided city, or an other America, to use the words of Dr. King. So Black unemployment in Pleasant Ridge is 25% compared to 4.8% of whites. This was in 2011. Black youth in Pleasant Ridge are more likely to be targeted by the police, less likely to take the ACT, and are less likely to graduate high school. The language of racial disparities used to describe the plight of Black youth in Pleasant Ridge is woefully insufficient, in my opinion. I suggest that these statistics reflect a specific form of anti-Black racism in which Black youth are structurally disregarded within schools, consistently surveilled around the city, and have very few spaces where Blackness is affirmed, and more specifically where their Blackness is dishonored and made to be threatening. My research situates Black youth workers and community-based organizations as powerful social actors in the lives of Black youth. And drawing on racial liberalism and Black crit as guiding frameworks, my research employs interviews with youth workers and observations of public events that were created to address racism in the city. And so I wanted to understand how Black community youth workers understand and challenge progressive and liberal discourses in predominantly white spaces. And I also wanted to understand how anti-Black racism surfaces in community-based programming with Black youth, and how does it inform Black youth workers' pedagogical practices. So there are three core theoretical ideas that were important to how I made sense of my research and how I analyzed my data that I received from interviews as well as observations. In education, liberal discourses and ideals of equal opportunity result in efforts to increase racial diversity, create inclusive spaces, and equitable opportunities for those who are disadvantaged. These efforts can be empty and devoid of a deeper analysis of white supremacy and anti-Blackness, and have no desire to redistribute power. What becomes very seductive about a progressive ethos is that it does not deny the significance of race. It is open to incremental change and supports undoing legacies of discrimination and racial subordination. However, it is not committed to a redistribution of power. In other words, liberalism may not attempt to redistribute resources, which calls for the relinquishing of privilege, power, and resources. As such, liberal discourses often fail to reckon with anti-Blackness. Anti-Blackness is endemic to American society, and it is at its foundation. In a city like Pleasant Ridge, one that celebrates the quality of life for its residents and where Black youth experience many forms of violence within and out of schools, the specificity of naming anti-Black racism is imperative here. A Black crit lens, conceptualized by Michael Dumas and Kiana Mariah Ross, calls for a critical theorization of Blackness and confronts the specificity of anti-Blackness as a social construction, as an embodied lived experience of social suffering and resistance, and as an antagonism in which the Black is a despised thing in itself, in opposition to all things humane, human, and white. Anti-Blackness is a specific denial of humanity for Black people and Blackness, marked by gratuitous violence, forced disconnection from homelands and home places, and general dishonor and disregard within all forms of social, cultural, and political life. As Michael Dumas writes, the Black cannot be human, is not simply an other, but is something other than human. As Dumas and Ross argue, Black crit aligned with Gloria Ladson-Billings and Bill Tate's critique of liberal multiculturalism helps to explain precisely how Black bodies become marginalized, disregarded, and disdained, even in their highly visible place within celebratory discourses on race and diversity. Typical white liberal discourses that attempt to be more equitable or solve racial inequities do not interrogate discourses and policies that are inherently anti-Black in the ways they render Black bodies disposable and positions them as threats to others, as seen through the process of school desegregation, school discipline practices, and perpetual violence at the hands of the state with impunity. In fact, common liberal tropes supporting multiculturalism, diversity, or equity talk in education often ignore the depths of Black suffering at the hand of the state, district, and school-wide educational policies. Educational discourses that result in policies and strategies for reducing inequality are widespread, yet the very existence of these attempts to lessen the achievement gap fundamentally ignores the fact that the American educational system was intended to educate Black youth. The education debt, as Gloria Ladson-Billings terms, documents the systemic exclusion of Indigenous, Black, and Mexican youth from schooling in the U.S., denying them the right to literacy, use of their native languages, and cultural practices. I believe that attempts on the left to level the playing field rightly points out the inherent exclusion of Black youth in the education system, but focus on policies that seek to correct these wrongs often assumes that it was intended to work for them in the first place. And so for additional context, I think it's also important to explore the connections between sort of predominantly white, liberal, progressive towns that are recognized for being nice places to live. Right? And I want to make sure that we address sort of the emotionality of whiteness. Okay? And this is important to the context of Pleasant Ridge. So 75% of residents in Pleasant Ridge are white. Only 6.4% of the population is Black. So 8.7 are Asian, 7% are Latinx, 0.285% are Native American or American Indian, and 3.5% are classified as being other. Okay. So what I want to make clear, right, is when we think about the sort of emotionality or the responses by white folks when there have been claims of racism or anti-Blackness. Pointing out anti-Black racism is often met with argumentation or denial or defensiveness or guilt or other explanations rooted in what some term emotionality or fragility among white people. As sociologist Crystal Fleming writes, while there are some white people committed to disrupting the racial order, some develop repertoires of denial, erasure, and distancing, while others choose to believe the most naive interpretation of racial matters and perform what Eduardo Bonilla Silva terms structured ignorance, or as Charles Mills terms, an epistemology of ignorance. As this ignorance is questioned in the face of acts of racism or in the context of racial dialogues, many white people will reject and or respond with a specific kind of emotionality which can lead to anger, gaslighting, retreat, or tears. Intellectual alibis are often provided as well, as Zeus Leonardo explains. When confronted about racist behavior, white people may refer to their parents or grandparents marching alongside Dr. Martin Luther King, or they may retort with the fact that they voted for Barack Obama, or name the charities they give to, or discuss the non-white children that they might have as evidence of their anti-racism. I think taking together these ideas, these frameworks were helpful in guiding my research with Black youth workers in Pleasant Ridge. And within education, I believe strongly that the voices of youth workers are overlooked. I think youth workers are overlooked as pedagogues, right? As professionals with philosophies and an understanding of how to approach young people and how to educate young people. Their experiences are often dismissed within educational literature and then also within the broader educational discourse. And so I want to highlight the voices of Black youth workers. And after conducting interviews with youth workers and attending local events in Pleasant Ridge dedicated to discussing racial disparities in the city, there are three salient things that I learned that I'd like to share with you all. So the first is that in 2013, there was a report that was released highlighting many of the racial disparities in the Pleasant Ridge context. And so when this report came out, many longtime white residents expressed this deep shock about the statistics. Yet many Black youth workers and Black residents overall were not surprised. The shock and surprise from white residents upset many youth workers in my study. And they expressed that Black people have been speaking about racism in Pleasant Ridge for years, but their suffering was ignored. So living in Pleasant Ridge for roughly 15 years, Sam is a youth worker on the west side of Pleasant Ridge. And he was angered by the release of the report and the subsequent surprise from white residents. And so he explained to me that that thing is kind of a joke. And that thing he's referring to is the report. There's lots of money put behind sort of the release of this report. And he goes on to say that Black people have been saying how white people didn't believe them. And so with that just being the common knowledge, the time and money that has been spent towards putting that report together and putting it out there is just ridiculous, right? Like it's absolutely not productive at all. The concern expressed by white residents in Pleasant Ridge during local forums felt disingenuous to youth workers, especially Sam. Sam also goes on to say that that nothing at all was surprising, and when white people react to it in a very shocked way, I feel like that's just telling, right? It's showing me your cards, because how the hell did you guys not know this was going on? Sam's frustration with the shock or structured ignorance on the part of whites was palpable during our interview. So when the report was released, everybody wanted to have an event. Everyone wanted to have a forum, a discussion, a dialogue. And so there were many conversations and events that took place at local universities, in K through 12 schools, in community organizations and churches. And so there was a local university's annual diversity forum that featured several workshops dedicated to unpacking the racism experienced by Black people in the city. In the question and answer period, there was, for a session that was actually called A Divided City, a white woman in the audience posed a question to the panelists. She stood up and said, well, how can we find the time to help them? How can we let them know that we're embarrassed about these statistics? After her question, an eerie silence fell over the room as panelists looked at each other with wide-eyed confusion before another panelist, a white man, actually responded, it's not about helping. Helping does not come from a place of love. It's not a loving space. Reflecting a tone very prevalent at most events tackling anti-racism and anti-Black racism in Pleasant Ridge, this woman's question was not about finding ways to dismantle racism and systems of oppression. Rather, the comment centered on her own emotions and her desire for Black people to know that some white people were embarrassed by the racism. This exchange represents how racist paternalism can be cloaked in niceness and politeness, and it's so prevalent in the city as many participants explained. The awkward silence from audience and panelists speaks to the discomfort whiteness causes when it is centered and demands comfort, which shifts the attention away from Black suffering and structures of power and oppression. Wahid was a longtime youth worker who lived in Pleasant Ridge for about 4 years around the time we had this conversation. And he expressed that Pleasant Ridge had a very particular way of talking about Black youth and education in ways that blamed Black youth and their families and communities for underachievement. So instead of saying, oh, Black kids aren't achieving, Wahid explained to me, he believed that people needed to be much more upfront and just go straight there and say, no, well, the reason that Black kids aren't achieving is because of white supremacy, because the system is broken. And he continues and says that the status quo in Pleasant Ridge is that this is a great place to live. There's no conflict. Race is minimalized, meaning that, yeah, we may have some racial incidents, but it's not like insert any nearby city that has predominantly Black residents. So in other words, Black cities, that are nearby Pleasant Ridge were often compared to Pleasant Ridge as being worse, right? But racism and white supremacy, he goes on to say, played out in other ways. And he says that it's not just in violence; it's in racial inequities in schools and police harassment and Black folks not having opportunities. So the other major finding from my work was that youth workers felt as though there was a deliberate shutdown of conversations that were specifically about anti-Black racism or about racial disparities in the city. And so the second issue that surfaced was about deliberate shutdown among leaders of organizations that were often predominantly white, when, in particular, when Black youth or Black youth workers wanted to bring up issues of race. So as many scholars have noted, schooling in this country has been a site of suffering for Black youth. Community-based youth organizations have been pivotal in guiding young people through critical sense-making of social and political problems. In fact, my last job as a youth worker was working with high school students around social identity development, political education, critical media literacy. And in my research in Pleasant Ridge, I learned that Black youth workers and organizations led by white leaders had a difficult time organizing deliberate conversations and programming about racism with young people. In an interview with Wahid, he shared that the largest and most powerful funding entities in the city would not provide funding to organizations that are perceived to be too radical or too pro-Black. This was echoed by Gia. And Gia is a Black youth worker who works on the south side of Pleasant Ridge. And she works in a program that engages Black and Southeast Asian young people around racial, gender, and queer justice. And in her work alongside Black youth, Gia has been in an ongoing battle with the local school district to remove cops from schools and engage young people around police violence. As Gia explains, there's a lot of people that support our work in different ways. Some people are like, oh my gosh, it's so great that you're doing this reading program. I want to donate books. Or I have kids at my church that would love to come. But when we're talking about police violence, they're like, well, I don't want to do that because my uncle is the ex-police chief, so I'm not with you there. I think Gia's comments about the politics of funding demonstrates of funding as well as participation and support of her program demonstrates how many might use a personal collection like a family member being a former police officer to dismiss the systemic violence Black youth face. And one of the things that I think it's important to note is that one of the consequences of funding demands in youth programming is that there's pressure to appease donors and align organizational programming with that of a funder, which are often racialized, gendered, and classed. And so the political education that youth acquire in programs where there's a specific rhetoric around anti-Black violence or calling out white supremacy startled many and created a perception of Gia's organization as being much more radical than other youth programs in the area. Wahid also offered that in order for educational programs in Pleasant Ridge to engage Black youth in meaningful conversations about how racism shapes their lives, that program leaders and directors and youth workers must understand what justice is. And so he goes on to say here, When you're having conversations about race and politics, you have to have youth leaders, youth workers, directors who understand what justice is. But you have to have folks who aren't scared to call things for what it is, to use the word white supremacy, to use the word racism, to use those words without anyone getting mad. Let's use the same language when we're talking to kids, so when youth are able to recognize white supremacy, they can call it what it is. Similar, going back to Sam, had who would say that his organization tried to have conversations about race. And so here he explains, I do think that our center is uniquely different than other centers. And now that there's an effort, there's at very least an expressed willingness to go there. I think that we talk about wanting to foster that kind of environment and encourage those kinds of conversations. And a lot of times we do good in that. And there are times when things when things start to get shut down because people get uncomfortable. And in this conversation, he was actually referring to the white leaders of the program, the predominantly white board of the program. And he notes that even though the director of this particular program had an organizing background, but that there were still moments where he would be uncomfortable and have the power to shut things down. Echoing Sam's sentiments, I want to introduce you to Lawrence. And Lawrence was actually a professor at a local university and worked for the engaged arm of the university. And so he was tasked with, visiting schools and community organizations around the state. And so echoing Sam's sentiments about his supervisor's discomfort with certain issues, Lawrence told me, there's a lot of ways that white liberal progressive people just avoid situations that would force them to confront their discomfort. I mean, racism. And lastly, the next thing that I want to highlight is what I found to be this exploitation of Black youth workers' labor. And I want to say that this particular finding holds significance for the current fight for racial justice for me. The ongoing struggle for racial justice is exhausting, and there are ways in which Black folks and other racially minoritized people end up being responsible for absolving whiteness and white people's emotions. What I learned from my research are the ways Black youth workers felt exploited for their connections to young people and communities without proper compensation or denied promotions to leadership within their organizations. So after 4 years in his organization, Sam told me that there was an assistant director position available, and he was approached by several board members about applying. And Sam explains, so when the assistant director position came open, 3 or 4 board members talked to me about applying, and I did. I went to talk to the executive director and was told that I'm just not ready for it right now, and I got really pissed. And Sam felt really disappointed and led on because for some years before that, the director was in many ways sort of priming Sam for this position. And after probing on his supervisor's explanation for not being ready for the promotion, Sam told me that it was the director's discomfort in supervising him as a Black man. He says, quote, and what that was totally about was him not being able, him feeling like he couldn't supervise me. So well-funded organizations that engage Black youth in Pleasant Ridge are primarily run by white people. While this is well known, there are changes to increase the number of there aren't really changes to increase the number of leaders of color in Pleasant Ridge. Sam also mentioned that he has friends who have in other organizations who are Black youth workers who were, sort of pushing for positions of power or who were pushing to have conversations more explicitly about race. And he says that they were completely cut off or cut out, even fired from organizations for talking about it. And it being race and challenging organizations to have staff members that reflect the racial identities of Black youth in the program. So as another example, during a community event about police violence, Gina Bowers, who's a prominent Black organizer in Pleasant Ridge, spoke very candidly about how she feels exploited for her knowledge and expertise engaging Black youth. So she adamantly expressed, she says, most of us get up every day to help ourselves. You want to help, but when you go out to apply for a job and need a degree, which I don't have, they say no. Yet they call me every day and ask me about the kids. What kind of sense does that make? Because I don't have a degree? And most youth workers express feeling exploited or poked or prodded for their expertise about issues related to Black youth or racism in the city without having a role in decision making or without proper compensation. And I think what's important about Gina's comments here is that we know within organizations it varies in terms of who gets hired and who doesn't. And there are sometimes gatekeepers, and sometimes there's this question around sort of professionalization and formalizing um, the youth work profession. But there are often ways in which that can reproduce stratification. And so here, I think about even my own experiences as a youth worker. Some of the best youth workers that I've worked alongside did not have college degrees or advanced degrees. And so I know that I recognize that that's a tension in the field. And so Wahid also explained, similarly to Gina's comment, is that he often felt like white people in the city came to him as an academic exercise to learn about his experiences in Pleasant Ridge as a Black man. And so here he says, I had several times where I had to tell people who wanted to have who wanted to have coffee and talk about my experiences, my Black experience in Pleasant Ridge. I want to hear your story, Wahid, they would say. And then also tell me about how you got here. And he went on to say, like, there's only a few of us and they want to know how we're able to beat the odds. This refers to what Kevin Clay calls Black resilience neoliberalism, where Black people are expected to overcome oppression through their rugged individualism and triumphs against oppression. And Kevin Clay actually writes that this obscures the structural inequities and further harm among Black people and especially Black youth, right, as they are expected to beat the odds. And so, lastly, I want to end with a quote from Lawrence. And Lawrence worked again for the sort of the community engaged arm of the local university. And as I mentioned earlier, he spent time going back and forth to many cities and visiting organizations and schools. And he says that Pleasant Ridge was the most resistant. And he's here quoted saying, they won't admit that there is such a denial among the white people in power, and that's across the board. But I can't think of any work I've done, and I've been here for 17 years, where I haven't bumped heads with someone. And there's two things. He says there's this sort of smug arrogance, we're liberal, progressive, smart, and all that, whatever. And so you're not prepared to learn. And I think in cities similar to Pleasant Ridge, where white people are in leadership roles and community-based organizations engaging Black youth and other minoritized youth, if structured ignorance and denial and discomfort abound, it prevents Black youth from the socio-political development that they can obtain within these settings, and can also reproduce the racism, inciting and cultural violence that many young people experience in schools. And so I believe that cities that profess to be progressive and espouse liberal values of inclusivity and opportunity for all, yet have immense racial disparities that sustain educational inequality while preserving resources and opportunities for white youth, really need to be studied and interrogated carefully. Given the institutional constraints within schools, community-based educational spaces generally have more flexibility to guide Black youth in unpacking the racism they experience within schools and other domains of their lives. Youth hold a critical analysis of the world, and racial understandings can be safeguarded within community-based organizations if they are given the opportunity to do so and with the appropriate capacity for engagement. One of the things that I always say, based on my experiences as a youth worker, is that young people always have a critique of the world, right? They may not use the language or the terms that adults might use, but they can identify, right? They can identify social and political problems in their schools and communities. And Black youth workers who are committed to a liberatory community-based youth work must have the space to provide the programming that they deem necessary. And I want to say that, quite frankly, right, it is not the time, right, for white folks to be defensive about being called out about racism in this moment. I think that gaslighting and the denial of anti-Black racism in this moment would create even more harm, as we have all been witnesses to the public lynchings of George Floyd, Eric Garner, Tamir Rice, and far too many others. think in this current political moment, as state violence continues to kill Black people with impunity and allow physical and psychic harm in schools, and as there's an accelerated privatization of public education continues to restructure neighborhoods and change the nature of public education to a business enterprise, community-based educational spaces have been and continue to be sites that encourage awareness of and resistance to these atrocities. Predominantly white cities espousing a liberal ethos that claim to believe in social justice, yet continuously sustain structural racism that impedes the educational experiences of Black youth should be interrogated theoretically and empirically so that resistance and disruption can occur. I would also add that if you can't acknowledge this, right, as folks who are practitioners within schools or within community-based youth organizations, perhaps there needs to be critical reflection or reconsidering, right, the nature of your work. And so as I reach sort of the end of my talk, I want to share what I see as opportunities in this current moment for mobilization against racist violence, where I believe community-based youth organizations are essential and where they can really shine. Okay, so what does this current reality offer us, particularly for those who work in the out-of-school time sector, those who are committed to education more broadly? First, I've been noticing that there is a strengthening and renewing of positive youth-adult partnerships in the context of community-based youth organizations. We are all living in the same world, seeing the same things, and because of our own social positioning in society as race and class and gender beings, we experience the world differently. But this is a key moment to listen to young people as partners in their own learning, self-discovery, and activism. And I think in order to do this, we have to reframe our thinking about what we think youth are capable of and see them as collaborators in our fight for racial justice. The second thing that I've been noticing is a renewed activism and intergenerational organizing between young people and adults and adult allies and advocates within community organizations. So I've been inspired by so many youth work programs that have been open really since the beginning of the pandemic, caring for the children of first responders and medical practitioners. And I know program leaders and youth workers who are finding ways to do virtual programming, organize virtual graduations, while also standing alongside young people as they took to the streets to demand racial justice against anti-Black state-sanctioned violence. So intergenerational organizing and relationship building is essential. And the youth development space, youth development organizations, is a prime opportunity where this can occur and should be fostered, especially at this moment. Third, I think the present iteration of uprisings and rebellion against anti-Blackness and anti-Black violence more specifically offers us a critical reminder that the broader sociopolitical context of youth development is always present and demands our attention, our study, and our understanding. Having a real understanding of the nuances and complexities of racism, economic injustice, and settler colonialism and other sources of oppression and domination should shift our understanding of why we do this work. This demands that we reframe our work and abandon the idea that we're fixing young people, but rather recognizing that we are aware of systemic inequalities that shape the lives of the young people that we engage and shapes how we think about young people, which informs how we design programming, how we engage with and learn from young people. I think in doing so, we are forced to remove savior narratives, which breeds paternalism and deficit language that is so rampant in youth work, to honor young people and treat them and their communities and families with dignity and respect. And finally, I'd like to take this moment to talk about how in this work we need to foster dream spaces and sparks of imagination with young people in the context of community programs. So in July, I had the opportunity to organize a webinar for the Spencer Foundation, and I had the opportunity to gather youth workers and activists and scholars to talk about the power of youth work and how important it is that we wrestle with multiple pandemics. A program leader from Milwaukee named Shannon Reed raised a question about how we foster dream spaces for young people amid all that's happening in the world. And this question really stuck with me. I think that I had been at that moment in a state of despair and felt really unsettled and lost. And what I loved about that question is that about fostering dream spaces is its connection to a social justice approach to youth development. And I believe that we must simultaneously be aware of and challenge oppressive structures while holding on to hope that allow us to fight, to dream, and to thrive alongside young people. And so with that, I want to thank you for listening, and I look forward to questions and discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Baldridge. I believe that after listening to you, I suspect that everyone understands why we were so thrilled to have you, the sort of depth of your work, and as well as obviously the commonalities that I think you can see between the context of your work and the context that we live in here. So, before we turn to questions and answers, I did want to let people know that we are having a small group discussion with Dr. Baldridge at 12:30 today. And if there are folks on here who would like to join that, you can email Youth-Nex. Leslie has just put the email address in the chat below, and she will share the Zoom information for that small group discussion if you are interested in that. So now I wanted to turn it over to our audience, and I will say, just from looking, I'm incredibly excited. I can tell we have a number of community members and youth workers in the audience. I'm recognizing names, so really excited to see that. So welcome everyone. If you have a question for Dr. Baldridge, you can either put it in the question answer, and I will go ahead and read it out, or you can raise your hand and we will unmute your mic. So great. So I'm going to start with a question we have gotten in. So this comes from BGC, which I know is the Boys and Girls Club of Central Virginia. So thank you so much for the focus on youth workers' perspectives, including your own, and for your time today. What are some ideas for staff and board leaders of philanthropically funded youth supporting agencies to consider in order to best educate their communities on important topics like anti-racism?
Thank you so much for that question. I have a few ideas. And for me, one of the first things is going back to language and framing, which I believe is deeply connected to how we think. And so in my experiences with philanthropic organizations, there's often this way in which deficit language is used to capture the work. And in my connection to youth workers who really try to push against that, there tends to be this struggle, right, in this tension in not wanting to, I don't want to say, in many ways, sell out the young people that they're working with and defining them in different deficit ways in order to get funding. And so I think that philanthropic organizations really need to take their lead, right, from organizations that are already engaged in and deeply engaged in anti-racist work with young people, who frame their organizations from a position of strength in thinking about young people as assets, right? And who don't sort of look at young people in their organizations as sort of lacking, right? And I think the philanthropic organizations and boards can look to organizations that do that work to understand that first thinking needs to be shifted, and then language needs to follow. And I think they reinforce one another. And so if I, if there were organizations where that were where whose mission statements and values and core beliefs centered on the humanity of young people, and sort of not what they are perceived to be lacking, I think that can begin to sort of shift how philanthropic organizations, can address and sort of working with community organizations. And I think there was another part of that question. I think I lost it, but.
Let me go over to that section and see. Board leaders and bodies. That's no. I think you got it. I think you got it. So I'll go on to the next question. Can you talk about the impact that a youth-serving organization that serves predominantly Black and Brown youth that does not address current events or racial tensions with their staff or youth will have on the lives of all of those in the mix? It's a very timely question.
Yep. Thank you, Mia, for that question. You know, frankly, I think it's irresponsible. I think it's irresponsible not to have those conversations. You know, young people are watching the news, right? Young people have lost loved ones due to the global health pandemic, to police violence and other forms of violence, right? So young people are living in the world just as we are. And one of the things that I've always admired, and one of the reasons why I love working in community organizations, is because of the flexibility, right, that community organizations typically have. Now, I've done some research where I know that depending on funding sources and other kinds of constraints, not all youth work organizations have the same level of flexibility, but for the most part, right, there aren't these sort of political constraints that oftentimes exist in many classrooms, many school spaces. And so I think it's the responsible and just thing to do to be able to um, allow young people to begin to unpack what they're experiencing, what they're feeling. Um, I think what's important about this, and what one of the, I think, to answer your question about the sort of the cost of not doing this, is that I think if you are helping young people to think about the problems that they see and live through in their schools and communities. And if you help them understand that as political, systemic, structural problems, what they end up doing is not thinking about those problems as a fault of their own or as a fault of their communities or their families. I think it's really important that we sort of shift, right, the focus not on sort of these individual and cultural explanations for perceived failure or things like that, but to really think about systemic violence and structural violence. I also think it allows young people to have language. You know, I have to think about sort of the importance of naming trauma, like identifying what it is and how healing that can be to know that there's a name for what you're seeing and experiencing. And I think the other part of that is it allows for not just an understanding of social and political problems, but also strategizing and talking to young people about how they want to make change and giving them access and opportunities and tools and strategies to be able to make those changes, right? To be able to think about social change in their communities.
Yeah, I think that's great, and I'll also I'm just going to add quickly. I think also you're not off the hook for talking about what's going on if you work predominantly with white kids or have white kids, right? Like that's also like critical for
Absolutely.
you know. So I think that's I think sometimes we tend to remove responsibility about and that. So just want to also like you're doing harm to Black and brown kids by not talking about it with white kids also, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And also doing harm to white kids. Right?
Yes.
Because then they go through the world sort of believing in sort of, superiority or that, those communities are failing or having these experiences because it's their fault. And they also don't have language to sort of think about sort of, structural, violence and white supremacy and things like that. So it's also harmful for them as well.
Yeah.
I'm always reminded of James Baldwin in his writing in that, right? And what in the sort of the um, the ways that their humanity is compromised, right? And believing in the myth of their own superiority. So,
Yeah. Yeah. So I love a question that starts out with the phrase, "This question is probably dangerous." So I'm going to throw it out there, and Dr. Baldridge, if you want to sidestep it, okay. How do we deal with the conflict of relying on donors who aren't willing to confront racism, but whose dollars feel critical to the sustainability of the organization?
yeah, it might feel like a dangerous question, but I love it. And one of the reasons why I love it is because in my research for my book, I worked with grant writers and youth workers who always had to negotiate this question. And I want to really humble myself, right, and acknowledge that community-based leaders and youth workers have difficult jobs. And I understand that you need to keep the doors open, right? that you want to keep programs going, that you want to have a place where young people can come to. And knowing that that can be jeopardized based on sort of upsetting particular donors is a real conflict and real tension. So, what I've seen, and I'm taking my cues from youth workers and grant writers who have done this, and I'm always amazed by the ways that that youth workers and community-based leaders are subversive, right? Are really in some ways um, sort of teaching, right, donors how young people how they want to frame young people, right, in more humanizing ways and less deficit ways. And then also sometimes, taking the money or sort of writing grants in a way to get money. And then when it comes to actual programming, um, you know, to sort of flip the script, so to speak, and do what they want in a way that's true to their beliefs and their ideals. And so, I mean, I understand that this is a tension. And I think that, again, I've seen youth workers who are crafting language in a way that is subversive, that's sort of pushing back, um, having frank conversations about how and why it's important that not just the field of youth work, but philanthropy, um, reframes their work and explaining how and why there are benefits and rewards to sort of reframing the work, and not from a deficit perspective, right, but from an asset-based and asset-rich perspectives, with an understanding of how and why these organizations exist in the first place, right? So, so I recognize the tension. I'm grateful for the question, and I think that whenever there's opportunities to resist and push back, I think that's a good thing. One example that I can share too is it's written in my book, but one of the donors that the organization that I studied worked with, there was this one donor who wanted to give um, Christmas gifts to children. And so there was a lot in the requests. There was or really the demand for this money to be spent. So there was an assumption that one, some of these ideas around like Christmas and things like that, but also about this perception about what kids were lacking. And so the ask was, well, give give this money to the kids in your program and their siblings so that they can have a good Christmas. And so for the organization that I worked with, the leadership, they were a little unsettled by that request. It's not something that's not something they typically respond to. And so what they ended up doing was creating a community event with the money, right? So they didn't buy individual gifts. They created a community event, a sort of a holiday party where community members and families and young people in the program participated. And so that was their way of, doing what they wanted to do with the money, and also feeling that they were, that they were able to sort of keep their integrity.
Great, thanks. So we've only got a couple of minutes left. We have two questions still in the queue, so I'm going to try to get through them if we can really quickly. And so the first one is, I think, particularly important for a school of education. In thinking about the way we prepare youth workers and youth services professionals, particularly considering the demographic most prevalently represented in that space, I'd like to hear some of your reflections on what additions or changes need to be made to pre-service programs that would cultivate stronger youth workers and youth service providers.
Yeah, I love this question. Um, and I think that one thing that I appreciate, right, is that there's a particular kind of way that youth workers are engaging young people, right? I think that we tend to understand sort of the purpose of being youth centered in our approach, of recognizing the whole child, and that young people's identities are complex, and all of that. We do a good job of that. So much so that many teacher education programs sometimes will place pre-service classroom teachers into youth work organizations. And so that happens in Madison and some other contexts that I know of. And I'm like, we should be proud, right, that that happens, right? There's a way that we engage that is often that teachers can't or don't for all kinds of constraints in schools. But I think, to answer your question, I strongly, strongly, strongly believe that anybody who's engaging with young people need to step back and critically reflect on who they are. And I think in particular in programs, we don't do a good job of, of pausing and allowing people to really reflect on who they are, how their positioning in society, racially and gender, and sort of their points of privilege. And I also think we need to sometimes be okay with coaching people out of the profession. And I want to be clear about that, right? I'm sensitive when it comes to young people, period, right? All young people, and especially those who are vulnerable. And I think that, if someone's thinking or framing, if they're coming in with this idea that they want to save kids, right? That they are this sort of superhero and they're going to lift the downtrodden, kids out of their communities, and that framing needs to be challenged. And so, to be more specific, I'd say that programs need to really focus on who people are, and people need to do their critical reflection on who they are. I think the framing, right, of programs need to shift, right? We're not saving people, right? That there's nothing that needs to be fixed or broken about communities, right? But that what is broken and what's what's difficult, right, are these larger systems of oppression. So I think that needs to be at the forefront. And then I think after that, right, then like specific training on anti-racism and other kinds of practices and tools around pedagogy can be important. But I do think that there has to be a radical shift, a radical just reshift in how we're thinking about ourselves and how we're thinking about the populations that are being engaged and who we understand youth work is for. So, and I mean, I know we're a little over time, but I do want to say that the entire field, I think, of out of school time and youth work, when it comes to young people of color, it's often framed as though, well, this is something that's good for them. And it's framed that way, again, not because of structural inequality or, structures of domination and racism and all these things. It's because we're perceiving these communities as somehow deficient. And I think that has to be dislodged from any kind of training program. Like, it has to be disrupted, thrown out. And the language, right? Sometimes we have to really look at the language. What do our brochures say? What do our websites say? What are the materials that we give, potential youth workers? What are we giving them that reinforces these ideas? And so I think that also has to be shifted and reframed as well.
That's thank you. Great response. So we are out of time. We do have 3 more questions. I also do want to give you, Dr. Baldridge, some time to go eat and refresh yourself before our 12:30 small discussion. So I think what we will have to do is sort of close it for now, but these are some great questions. I'll throw them out there so people know what they are, and then perhaps we could start with those in the 12:30 small discussion, and hopefully some of you who've asked these questions could come to that. And if not, you could feel free to engage us. If you email me, I'm happy to connect you with Dr. Baldridge if that's okay with her, and so we can figure out a way. But the question, so one was to have you speak more about the framing that you've done in some of your other work as youth workers, as cultural workers, and why that framing is important and how it contributes to building or expanding on youth possibilities. There was another question about the tension between cultivating youth socio-political development in a social justice-oriented space, while also acknowledging there's youth who come from families from more conservative ideological backgrounds, and trying to give that tension language while not creating a false equivalency. And finally, there's the final one was sort of acknowledging the commonalities between Pleasant Ridge and Charlottesville. And that there are many people in the community who want to do something but struggle in knowing what to do. And so how we can encourage authentic work with youth without giving into that do-gooder helper who does not see or want to address systemic issues that we have in our community. So how we can start breaking down systems in order to move forward and out of that cycle that we've been in for years. That feels like an important and big place to unfortunately end. So, but I hope that you all will join us. Those questions have been saved, so we will try to get to some of them at 12:30. And for those of you who are not able to join us in that, we welcome you to engage us via email. Thank you so much, Dr. Baldridge. This was incredible. I am so excited to have been able to learn from you during this hour and appreciate what you have brought to this speaker series. So I hope you all will join us. I guess no one can join me in applauding, but we're all virtually applauding you. Thank you all for attending, and we will see many of you in just about 25 minutes.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.